So there's been some changes in the schedule, not to the necessarily to the topic of the presentation, but there has been some changes with the presenters. That one of the presenters will be going in the next panel, so it is slightly different than the schedule. So today we have three presenters. We have Kean Birch, Ju Hyoung, and not Sean Starr, sorry, Eric George, who is this person. And I guess Kean will start.
Okay. So thank you very much to the organisers, and especially Sandy. I'm new to York, so it's a good opportunity to kind of get to meet people, display my wares, that sort of thing, and hopefully not crash and burn at the very start of my career here. Okay, so I'm just going to start with some caveats, just to kind of give myself some legroom or leeway. I'm afraid I'm not that familiar, to say the least, with the capitalist power concept. But despite that, I hope what I have to say is of interest and is relevant, and considering the papers that we've already seen while I've been here yesterday, I hope it is. So what I'm presenting today is, and I must stress this, it's a work in progress. So I have a working paper, but if you're interested, but be warned, it is 18,000 words long, so I'm not sure if you want to, I don't know, drag your way through it. So, the working paper is essentially the start of my interest in public debt and financial markets, financialization. And I'll start off with why public debt. And Sandy has talked about this yesterday. Public debt, for me, my interest in public debt started several years ago now when I was reading Bruce Carruthers' City of Capital, which talks about the expansion of the English debt, national public debt after the Glorious Revolution in 1688. And I found this quite an interesting book, and it's an interesting look at the kind of emergence of the English national debt, the emergence of the kind of national financial elites in England, and the way they get tied into the continuation of the kind of English state through their involvement in funding the state and providing the loans to the state. So that's where I start from. It's also interesting because Bruce Carruthers talks about the South Sea bubble as a consequence of this kind of expansion of the national debt in the 17th century. And obviously this reflects today's events with the current crisis. So, my starting point for this talk is neoliberalism, as the title should have indicated. So I have an interest in neoliberal restructuring and neoliberalism generally, but I started thinking about neoliberalism in relation to the current crisis. And analytically, we need to avoid this the assumption that neoliberalism is basically the explanation for a particular event, phenomenon, and so on, so for the financial crisis. So neoliberalism is this thing that needs to be explained, is one argument. But again, if we assume that neoliberalism is the thing that needs to be explained, we need to assume that neoliberalism is actually out there. It's a thing already existing. So I started thinking about the notion of neoliberalism and whether it's the kind of at fault or drove the recent financial crisis, ongoing financial crisis, I should say. What does this mean, this connection between neoliberalism and the financial crisis? And this is especially relevant in light of reading the work of people like Giovanni, and I'm sorry, I'm going to murder the pronunciation, Urigi. I don't know how to pronounce his surname, so I apologize for that. But his point that there are recurrent financial crises that reflect the kind of sign of autumn for particular hegemonic powers, in this case the US. So can we say that the current crisis, current ongoing crisis, is neoliberal, caused by neoliberalism? And there are arguments that neoliberalism is linked directly to things like financialization, the expansion of the financial sector, and so on. Sorry, can I have a side point? How long have I got to talk for?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay, great. So there are people like David Harvey who specifically says financialization is an example of accumulation by dispossession. And after the 1980s, we have the expansion of speculative, predatory kinds of financialization. Duminil and Levy talk about they actually literally talk about a 1979 coup, in which they relate the Volcker shock, the hike in interest rates, as a kind of a coup of the neoliberal order. And then there are others who argue that there's a relationship between neoliberalism and financialization. So what I'm going to do is talk about corporate monopoly in the kind of neoliberal thought, and use this to illustrate a point that neoliberalism, neoliberals adapt to their context rather than necessarily force their context to adapt to them. And this, then, I'll go on to discuss financialization. My basic argument being that financialization is a process that was underway prior to, if we think of what Duminil Levy or others call the 1979 coup, or the emergence of the kind of Thatcher and Reagan governments. And this was linked, financialization is linked to the origins of financialization is linked to the emergence of euro markets, which, Jeremy Green talked about yesterday. So this rise of this kind of stateless financial markets. And then I'm going to talk about national public debt, and talk about national public debt as a kind of mechanism for the financial transformation of the economy, for controlling inflation and for the regressive redistribution of wealth that occurred. And then I'll talk a little bit about the kind of complicity, who's at fault, that sort of thing. Okay. So to start with, neoliberalism. Now, anyone who studied neoliberalism would have got will understand that it's a fairly heterogeneous kind of subject. You can start out with a particular kinds of perspective on what neoliberalism is, and after you start exploring it more, you end up with just more and more variety, if you like, variety of neoliberalism. It's heterogeneous, it's evolving, it's mutating. And it's evolving and mutating from the start. So in the origins, in if we want to use the kind of classic origin story of neoliberalism in the colloquy Walter Lippmann in 1938, organized by Louis Roger, we have a number of different kinds of neoliberals represented there. All of them are interested in the same kind of problem. How do we institute, or how do they institute laissez-faire in the 20th century? And all of them are interested in some ways, the same kind of solution, retasking the state to rehabilitate liberalism and avoid collectivism at the same time. So there are a number of different types of neoliberal that we can identify. The paleo-liberal of the likes of von Mises, thank you, who has been described as an unreconstructed or unreconstructible liberal. The likes of the ordo-liberals of the Freiburg school, the German school, who were the originators of the social market economy in West Germany after World War II. And then there are the kind of new liberals or neoliberals that are associated with the various schools, the Austrian school, the kind of British people associated with the LSE in Manchester, and most important, the American school, the people associated with the Chicago school. Now we can distinguish between two types of Chicago school, the first and the second Chicago school. I think I'm going to run out of time very quickly. Is it?
It's been 9 minutes.
Okay. So I'll skip that slide. So the Chicago school can be split into two kinds of eras, the first Chicago school and the second Chicago school. The previous slide was just a slide of quotes about corporate monopoly by various neoliberals. Now, there's a lot of interesting kind of recent historical research on neoliberal thinking from the early period leading into the later period, and it reveals this kind of evolution of thinking on corporate monopoly. And this is relevant for analysing the relationship between neoliberalism and financialization. The early kind of first Chicago school is very anti-monopoly, anti-corporate monopoly, anti-any kind of monopoly, basically, because it interferes with competition. Now, the major kind of figure in this first Chicago school is Henry Simon, but other people like Friedrich von Hayek, Milton Friedman, etc., share similar views. Then there's the second Chicago school, which we see from the 1950s onwards, which is a consequence which Rob Van Horn and Philip Morawski have argued is the consequence of these two research projects, the free market study and the antitrust project. And these create a shift in neoliberal thinking about monopoly. And this shift is away from the idea that monopoly is a problem because it will stop competition, but towards the idea that competition will actually end monopoly. And that monopoly can be efficient because large multinational corporations or large corporations, etc., can produce goods using economies of scale. So actually consumers benefit from lower prices and so on. Now, I'm highlighting this discussion, this kind of change in neoliberal thinking about monopoly in order to make the point that what we see here is neoliberals adapting their ideas to the context in which they're in. They're not necessarily adapting the context with their ideas or driving the context with their ideas. And there's a key contradiction here regarding this kind of evolution of their thinking around corporate monopoly. So starting out with their basic starting point being the instituting of liberalism in the 20th century, we actually find that the context in which they are working, which they're trying to promote liberalism again, has changed. So in the 19th century, liberalism is associated with the British political economy, which is dominated by small, family-owned, tightly networked, globally tightly networked firms. In the 20th century, dominated by US multinationals, large corporations. So there has to be this shift. There's a shift in thinking about. Okay. Okay, so if you get closer. Yeah. So like that. Okay. Okay. So where does financialization fit in? So the basic argument is that neoliberalism does not lay the groundwork for financialization, for the expansion of financial speculation and that leads to the current crisis. It doesn't have origins necessarily in neoliberal thinking, neoliberal thought. If we look at early thinkers like Hayek and Friedman, they don't necessarily talk about financial markets. They mention international finance in relation to trade. Now, financialization is a process of power, basically. And it's about separating the economic power from political power. And financialization is involved basically a loss of control over domestic monetary policy. Now, this loss of control is actually originates in the kind of embedded liberalism after World War II. So it has its origins in the promotion of international trade and the need to transact international trade in foreign currencies. And this is where the euro markets come in. So the euro markets emerge as a consequence of the tensions in the embedded liberalism. They emerge in the 50s, basically encouraged by the UK and the US at various points. And there's a massive expansion of trading, transactions involved in the euro markets, where transactions go up from $200 million in 1959 up to $2.6 trillion in 1986. And there's a consequent loss of national control over finance. But it does not originate in neoliberal ideas or neoliberal theories. Okay. Now we can think, what about monetarism? What about something like monetarism and the impact that monetarism has? It's a classic neoliberal policy. Now this surely affects financial policy. But again, if we think about monetarism, it actually originates or precedes neoliberal kind of classic neoliberal government, Thatcher, Reagan. So how long is it? You just waved 5 minutes.
No, about to, yeah.
Okay.
Roughly 5.
Okay. So monetarism precedes these classic neoliberal governments of Thatcher and Reagan. It's also, rather than driving policies, it's also incorporated into existing political preferences and political goals. And that's why I've got the quote here. So, for example, Thatcher, Alan Budd, an economic advisor to Thatcher, talks about monetarism. It's not the correct way to bring down inflation, but it's a good way of raising unemployment and therefore reducing the strength of the opposition's support base. Now, why then can we see a turn towards financialization? As I said, it's a result of these international financial markets centered on the euro markets. Essentially, as I can't remember who was talking, was it Randall Wray was talking yesterday about the kind of taking over of the creation of money supply by private lending. So what we have is a rising inflation that then gets controlled by a rise in interest rates. So we need to understand interest rates to understand financialization. So this is just UK interest rates and inflation. Now, it's interesting. I'm just playing around with these figures. These are figures that I've just started playing around with and looking at, and so on and so forth. So I'm not. I'm not properly analysed them as such. Now it's interesting here to look at real interest rates, because real interest rates, which is the grey line, you can see there's a massive collapse in the 1970s. Now real interest rates collapse. Sorry. But we see afterwards, after the 1970s, at the end of the 1970s, we see the rise of interest rates again. And the creation of several plateaus of real interest rates over the following decades, the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s. Now, this leads to, obviously, financial gain for financial firms in terms of interest. And I would argue a drive towards financial innovation. So as we see real interest rates decline over the decades, we see the plateau shift downwards further and further, so the interest on these financial assets reduces over time. Hence the drive towards certain forms of financial innovation leading to riskier kinds of bets. So you could argue that the great moderation that we might see after that Ben Bernanke talks about is really just a kind of continuation of this financial innovation as a kind of big Ponzi scheme. So those got in early benefit by getting out early, but the others who are left behind get stuck with the poor assets. Okay, so what about national debt? Why relationship to national debt? So Marx talks about national debt as being a form of privative accumulation which can restart the accumulation project. That's what Sandy mentioned yesterday. So, the high interest rates that I just illustrated, the high real interest rates that I illustrated, help to drive up the value of these financial assets, especially drive up bond values. So bonds become the preferred means of to fund public spending in governments, as inflating away debt is the ability to inflate away debt is lost as the governments become more reliant on these international financial markets. Now, what we see here is a shift away from taxing the financial elite, the rich, towards borrowing from them. So you can see the national public debt, the increasing national public debt, as essentially a massive subsidy for the financial elite. But it's another part of this process is the tying of this financial elite then into the success of the state. So they need to continue funding the national public debt. So my argument is that the national public debt is basically the mechanism that ends up being used to control inflation and to provide these returns, asset returns for the financial elite. Okay. And we see a massive increase in, as a consequence, we see a massive increase in the national debt over the 1980s and 90s. Is that? Okay. Okay. So there you go. I was just going to talk a little bit about at the end about complicity, whose fault it is. Can we actually say that neoliberalism is the cause of the financial crisis, the economic crisis? And my argument would be that no, it's not the cause, it's financialization. And actually the mechanism that was driving financialization was the public debt. Okay.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Ji. Today I'm going to talk about neoliberalism as the complex of financialization, class power, and privatization. What is this? It's because actually this is an impossible attempt to understand and theorize neoliberalism in its entirety or in the most comprehensive way. But I think still there is some value in doing that because we can compare the actually existing neoliberal capitalism and this kind of a model, and then we can enrich our understanding of contemporary capitalism. So this is not an empirical work, it's a theoretical work, so I'm sorry that there is nothing substantially new about each element of neoliberal capitalism that I will be talking about. But I wish there should be something new regarding how I combine them and and how I create a narrative of how they relate to each other. Yeah, this is outlines. There are so many things to say, but maybe I cannot say everything here. But you say there are many phases of neoliberalism, at least 5. So ideology, Washington consensus, policy, governmentality, political project, and accumulation strategy. So neoliberalism is indeed a very complex phenomenon. And I use critical realism and strategic-relational approach as a methodology. And I'm afraid I can't really explain about this, but I will just summarize them in a few sentences. And then I will finish with the discussion of the complex order of neoliberalism, which is the complex relationship between at least these 3 strategies of neoliberalism, which are governmentality, class political project, and financialized accumulation strategy. What is neoliberalism? That is the question that I asked when I was working on this subject. It's because I could understand what it was, simply because it is the first reason that I studied it. But there's other reasons, because there is a politics of defining neoliberalism, because you see, after the crisis, the global economic crisis, there is plenty of competing interpretation of crisis, and which interpretations becomes dominant, actually influences the solutions of the crisis. And neoliberalism is blamed for causing the crisis. And then the question is, what is neoliberalism? And if it is a crisis. But many people suggest different meanings. So it's very important to define what neoliberalism in the first place. And when I talk about neoliberalism, I'm not merely talking about ideology. I'm also talking about capitalism. So it's better to call neoliberal capitalism. But then why it should be called neoliberal capitalism? I may have a chance to talk about it later in this presentation. And critical realism is a philosophy of science and philosophy of social science. There are three ontological levels, but that is not important here. I want to say that if we want to study contemporary capitalism, there are three levels of analysis. One is capitalism in general. Another is capitalism in particular in the form of probably neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism. And the other is ideology, neoliberal ideology. So there are three levels. So when I analyze neoliberal capitalism, I don't deal with capitalism in general. I just analyze neoliberalism as ideology and specific form of capitalism. And also, it means that we need to distinguish between neoliberal ideology and neoliberal political economic reality. And so this distinction is important because sometimes that we just get lost. We just follow. If we follow the ideology, then we lose the reality. So, okay. So it's a critical realism application. I will skip this. And this is complicated here, but I will talk about strategic-relational approach. Capitalist relations are very, very complex, and not only consists of capital-labor relations, but also capital society, capital capital, capital state, state to society, state to state relations. This is the actual relations in capitalism. So capital society relation can be characterized by sabotage, as in Veblen's work, capital labor relations, exploitations, capital capital, distribution, capital state. Could be, there is a cooperation and kind of conflict between the two, but the capital limits state and state limits capital. So there is a structural and strategic limitation of each other. State-to-society relations can be called governmentality, and I will talk about it later. State-to-state relations can be called international and transnational relations. Unfortunately, I have no time to talk about it. But these relations can be managed in very different ways. There are many ways to manage these relations. So there is strategic and institutional dimension to it. So this is where strategic relational approach enter. So these relations are strategically and institutionally mediated by ideology. I mean, in case of neoliberal capitalism, it is mediated by neoliberal economics, privatized governmentalities, class political projects such as neoconservatism and others, and the Washington Consensus policy and financialization, globalization, and labor flexibilization. I will start from the neoliberalism. Oh, yes, this is Hayek. They are Hayek and Friedman. And as you know, neoliberalism as an ideology suggests minimal state intervention and maximization of individual freedom. Yeah, it's very simple. Especially this individual freedom include the freedom of business to own, use, buy, sell, dispose the so-called asset. But the reality is the opposite: more state intervention and limited liberty. So this is just the ideology in the classical sense. It's false consciousness that justifies something which is extended capital accumulation of the dominant class. So it's a competition state, and freedom for the pike is death for the minnow is the reality. Okay, and then what neoliberalism is ideology, then what about the policy, real policy? Is it neoliberal? Yeah, some people say Washington Consensus is neoliberalism. Oh, yeah, but this kind of approach is not really an approach because there is no real analysis, because there is no political and economic analysis. So it just lists different policies and it says they are neoliberal policies. That's all. They don't really talk about which is more important or how they relate to each other. So, yeah, this is very limited understanding of neoliberalism as well. Then we come to governmentality studies. It's inspired by Foucault's work. And Michel Foucault describes the shift of state power from sovereign and disciplinary power to what he calls governmentality, which means art of government as well as governmental rationality. And yeah, I don't have to talk about sovereign power and discipline here, but governmentality here means self-limitation of a state, and then it gives the freedom to the subject and also the responsibility to the subject. So the subject self-govern him or herself, and in this way, power is exercised. So there are maybe two kinds of, we can distinguish two kinds of governmentality. So first, liberal governmentality in general. So in terms of rationality, it is characterized by biopolitics that focuses on the state of a population rather than the state of territory. This is why it is called biopolitics. And art of government, it is actually liberal political economy, the self-limitation of the state. And then this creates a society and the subject, free subject. So then comes the birth of self-governing and self-responsive subject through what Foucault and Foucauldians call conduct of conduct. And what is neoliberal governmentality then? It can be characterized by rise of governance, including public-private partnerships, and the rise of entrepreneurial subject and self-help and privatized risk management, especially through pension, insurance, etc. It is just completely opposite to collective help, mutual aid, etc. So it actually encourages individual solutions. And then the market operates as economic tribunal that evaluate the state performance. So, for example, as you know, international credit rating agencies, they rate sovereign ratings, and recently U.S. sovereign ratings downgrade. But the Foucauldian approach is actually has some problem with analysis of who and why this governmentality is operating. Yeah, who operates and who and why it is operated. Because they don't believe in there is a certain mastermind behind all this process. But even though there is no mastermind, there are always groups and forces, people who want to move society in a certain direction. So it's very important to pinpoint who they are. So we need to look at political forces behind the neoliberal capitalism and the aspect of capital accumulation. Yeah, so this is very famous politicians, Allende, Pinochet, Thatcher, and Reagan. Yeah, so there are neoliberal politics and political projects, very famous, well-known people and stories, and that is in general characterized by authoritarian statism. This is from Nikos Planjas' of the last work, and post democracy. So it's characterized by judicialization and formalization of politics and democracy, and the rise of administrative state and hegemony of finance industries. And yeah, there's nothing complicated about this. The problem with this is that I'll show that the people who advocate this kind of analysis includes David Harvey and Dumenier Levy. And David Harvey defines neoliberalism as a political project to restore the capitalist power and redistribute wealth. Although he is one of the forerunners in analyzing financial capital in Marxian terms through the concept of a fictitious capital, he does not pay particular attention to the financial aspect of neoliberal capitalism. It is because it cannot be considered as proper capital accumulation, because it is fictitious capital. And the problem is that the accumulation by dispossession is not unique to neoliberal capitalism. It's general feature of capitalism. So why is it the defining feature of neoliberal capitalism? So he fails, I think. And Dumenier and Levy is no better. They also tend to focus on the redistribution of profits from the real sector to the financial sector, and fail to give due attention to securitization and financial derivatives in accumulation process. But it is actually neither governmentality nor political project, but capital accumulation, I think, at the heart of neoliberal capitalism. Without talking about accumulation, we cannot grasp the essential feature of neoliberalism. So now let's look at neoliberal accumulation.
G.
Oh, yeah.
5.
5, okay. So it's very well known that capitals as neoliberal accumulation can be interpreted as a capitalist responses to increased uncertainty after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. So there are three. There can be more, but I can just list the three strategies. One is globalization, as you know, financialization, labor market flexibilization, and here is Nietzsche and Jonathan Nietzsche there, and I recently realized Nietzsche actually denies that there is a financialization, but I have no time to discuss here now. But I have reason to say that still we can talk about financialization. Anyway, I don't think I have to talk about financialization in detail here because you already know a lot about this. And why financialization is so there are at least three accumulation strategies: globalization, financialization, and labor flexibilization. And I think that among these, financialization is the most important feature and a critical feature. I can provide three reasons. One is that financialization actually maximizes business freedom advocated by neoliberalism, because and this business freedom is how can I say has two components. One is commodify. I don't know how can call it. The freedom to commodify anything, and use, buy, sell, and own and dispose assets owned by property owners. So, and I think that the asset-backed securities and financial derivatives maximize this kind of freedom by minimizing individual investment risk through owning only small bits of business. You don't have to have you don't have to take full responsibility of the management, and also it allows you to detour the resistance of the so-called fictitious commodities, especially labor, land, and other stakeholders. And it allows to commodify everything, almost everything, including something that you don't own through financial derivatives. And it also allows you to make realize profits instantly through discounting. And the second reason is that globalization and labor flexibility subsumed under financialization. There is financial dictatorship, and so, for example, investment banks can impose their own standards to players in the market, and that actually creates pressure for shareholder value, and there is some convergence between the industrial and non-industrial and so-called financial corporations. And the most important reason, the third one, is this one, the complex order of neoliberalism. And because financialization has a special role in maintaining this order of neoliberalism. I will skip this. This is too theoretical. Just the point is here. I don't say that there are only three elements of neoliberal capitalism, but this is for the convenience of presentation. So as we have seen, there are three elements: financial accumulation, class political project, policy and ideology, and privatized governmentality. And they actually are coupled, structurally coupled to each other, and support each other. So, for example, privatized governmentality. Let me start from privatized governmentality. So, private governmentality is characterized by self-risk management, self-responsibility. Then how do you manage your own risk? Through pension and insurance and other kind of financial investments. So financial accumulation actually provides means for risk management. And also in return, governmentality actually provides more business opportunity for financial capital. And private governmentality actually encourages people to seek individual solutions. Actually, it weakens the possibility of a collective action. And also, state is assessed by private standards and performance indications. So it actually supports class political project. And then this class political project in return provide ideology of freedom, choice, and entrepreneurship, and etc. And now, let's see what this class political project do for financial accumulation. Actually, it creates an environment in which financial dictatorship is possible. So there's a political support. Okay, so for this. And financial accumulation in return provide conservatization of the middle class. So there's a very functional relationship. But I don't say that this is completely functional and it won't change forever. So maybe if one of the pillars collapse, then the other two may collapse too. But it depends. All depends on how the actual process of actual social and political process go. That's all. Thank you.
Always a formatting issue. This presentation will be on the U.S. defense contracting sector. I would like to thank Joseph Baines in the first instance for helping me to retrieve what can be very difficult data to find and assemble. So my thanks to him. His criticisms in this project have been instrumental in its progress. This presentation is not about neoliberalism, it's about the defense sector. The presentation highlights changes that have occurred in the US defense contracting sector since the Second World War. I can say that as a student of political economy and international relations, over the years I had been exposed to multiple theories of what they normally or used to refer to as the military-industrial complex. The guiding animus of this research was therefore to see, did those theories still hold, or was there a new kind of relationship between the Pentagon and the US defense sector since the heyday of the Cold War? I must state also from the beginning that this research was inspired mainly by the work of Nitzen and Bischler, with whom I take courses. The research that they produced in specific in the global political economy of Israel. For those of you who have not read it, I cannot summarize the book, in fairness. You know this, Jonathan? I probably never will be able to. But suffice it to say that this model uses a Kalekian approach to the US defense sector. And the Kalekian approach, if I can just summarize very quickly, identifies different groups of capitalists who appropriate what I understand to be different streams of the national income. Therefore, Kalecki was able to identify a special class of defense contracting capitalists. He called them fascist, and I have no problem with that. But he also called them dogs on a leash and a series of other pejorative terms. For the purposes of this presentation, however, I will just call them the defense contracting class, or dominant defense contractors. I think it helps to start with a historical perspective. And you'll forgive me for the formatting. The last years are cut off by just a little bit. The graph is the national defense expenditures as a percentage of GDP using the NEPA tables. That is the National Income and Product Accounts, available online. It's quite a remarkable graph. You see very clearly the skyrocket in expenditures that follows the U.S.'s entry into World War II. And note that that is only in 1941. In other words, there's no major preliminary preparation for World War II. That's just a side note, not important here. What you see after is a de-escalation in expenditures to around 7% of GDP. After that, what we have is the Korean War. Now, there you get a spike in expenditures to around 15 to 17%. But what's most notable, and what most theorists of the military-industrial complex, from Barand and Sweezy to Seymour Melman, to other names that I'm sure you are familiar with, noted is that following that war, you only had a relatively small decrease in expenditures. For the period of the end of the Korean War to the Vietnam War, you have relatively high US military expenditures, sometimes between 8 to 12% of GDP. Again, if you can focus to the period, say, 1970 to about the early 1980s, there you have what I would say is a quite major decline in US defense expenditures, down to around 5% of GDP. Since the 1970s, there have been two major efforts, I would argue, to boost national defense expenditures. Now, as a student, I always learned that Ronald Reagan had set the record for spending on national defense. But of course, the problem is always how you measure this. And there have been plenty of arguments and debates about measurement in the past 2 days. I think it is instrumental to display national defense expenditures as a percent of GDP to get a relative and historical notion of what that magnitude has been. So you see Reagan. He only succeeds, really, and I don't mean to downplay the reactionary nature of his politics that we're all familiar with and the last two presenters gave us an extensive breakdown of. I just mean to highlight that the relative nature of those spending pushes. Same with Bush. If you see the Clinton era following the Cold War, what they normally refer to in the literature as a peace dividend, the disappointing peace dividend because it only reduced expenditures to around 4 or 5% of GDP. Now, that's the United States. That's a special case. They spend way more on national defense expenditures than any other country, and probably all the other countries combined, in fact. I don't have that data here now, but I can send it to you. Just email me. This is what surprised me in this project. I would have thought, and just from remarks that I have heard, not only from academics, but in the news as well, about the recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, I would have hypothesized that those expenditures would have been very high. And this is all over the literature when I started researching this project. You see people who say, we've had a $2.8 trillion surge, or that the war in Iraq has cost more than the war in Afghanistan, or a recent commentator, Carl Canetta, asks, why has the war in Iraq cost more to our nation than the wars in Korea and Vietnam? Now, the problem there is very simple. They're simply calculating the cost of the war in constant dollars without making it relative. So the problem is very simple. So that surprised me. The Bush regime push, and don't get me wrong, I am against them, was small. I am therefore inclined to agree with the piece put forth by Nielsen and Bischler and updated recently called Cheap Wars. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been relatively cheap. Now, again, in looking through the literature, if you look at the way that the data are presented, many people, especially academics on the left, since they are opposed to war, I guess they feel the need to show how taxing the expenditures have been on the US nation. But again, in relative terms, it has not been that much. I cannot hammer this point across more. If you turn to figure 2, when I was doing this, since I was interested in defense contractors, I hypothesized the following. If you have wars, then it would follow that you have an increased demand in all those traditional budget items that you would expect to find on a national defense budget. Those being ships, missiles, weapons, and especially attack aircraft. What I did in the following graph is I took, again, from the NEPA defense tables, which list budget items. These are only select items. You have aircraft, personnel support, missiles, weapons support, and software as a percentage of the total NEPA defense budget. Now, this one, I have to say, really shocked me. Because what you see is, although you have an increase in purchases of aircraft, say during the Reagan years, these really declined during the 1990s. And the same goes for missiles. Actually, what I mean to point out here is that since 2000, you have not seen an increased share of those traditional budget items that you might expect would increase with an increase in war. And we have 2 wars. So no relative share increase in missiles, aircraft, and I don't have all the data here because I didn't want to mess up the graph, but the same goes for tanks, ammunition, and a whole series of other budget items. This really surprised me. I thought, again, that the Afghanistan and Iraq wars would have increased those budget items. Which leads me to the next question. What does increase with the rise of wars? Well, you have this category called personnel support. Personnel support includes an entire series of logistics capacities, and therefore I am inclined to agree with the assessment of this commentator William Hyoung, who says that contrary to the myth that wars are uniformly good for the defense sector, what you might have in Afghanistan and Iraq, and here he was writing in 2005, is a relative increase of the share of the Pentagon budget to building construction and logistics and other items that we find in the personnel support category. As I'll get to later when I show you the breakdown of what I consider to be dominant defense contractors, only slightly different than Nielsen and Bischler's concept of the Arma Corps, I think there is evidence to show that construction and logistics contractors have appropriated a larger share of the Pentagon budget. Of course, and I don't want to forget, you have this other category of software, which increases slightly. Actually, it's not there, is it? Let's move on. Again, a brief summary of the work of Nitzen and Bichler. In their work, what they had done is construct an index called the ARMA Core. The ARMA Core includes 15 of the top defense companies from the period 1965 till when you published that book, which I think was in 2001. Now, the purpose of that work was to show the historical trajectory of the accumulation of that sector. Now, since the publication of Nitzen and Bichler's work, there have been two major phenomena. Number one are the wars. And the second thing that I was interested in is if indeed the mergers and acquisitions had succeeded in concentrating the defense sector to the extent that Nitzen and Bichler argued, then it would seem logical to suppose that those defense contractors would be able to appropriate a larger share of the Pentagon budget. The tables that I've given to you, and I'm sorry I didn't have enough handouts for everyone, I just want to draw your attention to the last figure. It's a percentage. It's a percentage of the top 10 defense contractors' appropriation of the total Pentagon budget for the years 2005, 1997, 1993, and 1986. Now, if you look in 1993, that is right before the mergers and acquisitions movement happens. And you can even see, for example, many of the titles of the companies, Lockheed, Martin Marietta, and Grumman, for example, are in their pre-merger company names. There you have the top 10 companies appropriating about 10% of the Pentagon budget. Now, it would seem logical to think that after the merger process, where you have a concentration of the defense contractors, they're then therefore able to appropriate a larger share of the Pentagon budget. And I would wager that that means an increased share in the relative power of the defense contractors' appropriation of the U.S. national defense budget. And I was not disappointed. By 1997, the same top 10 contractors are appropriating around 25% of the national defense budget. But I would have to temper this because what I thought is that if you had wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, those same contractors would appropriate a new lion's share of Pentagon spending. That's simply not the case. In fact, the top 10 have, since 1997, have a reduced share of the Pentagon budget. So I was a bit disappointed in that respect. I confess that I wanted to show you unscientifically that those top 10 contractors were more powerful than they had ever been before. Finally, from these tables, another relationship that you can see is the introduction of new names on the top 10 companies. And I don't have them for every year, but you will see, for example, the names of Halliburton, Bechtel, another company called Fluor Corporation, which is a construction company, and also another company called Oshkosh, no relation to the overall company, which makes trucks. All of those companies are involved in and had a major share of the construction projects in Iraq. Now, I wanted to show that those contractors were more powerful, or relatively powerful, using Nitzen and Bichler's concept of differential accumulation and differential capitalization, than the defense core. Unfortunately, I was not able to show this relationship. The top 10 defense contractors still, no matter what measure you used, and I used multiple measures, they're still way more powerful by any stretch of the imagination than Halliburton, Bechtel, etc. can claim to be. The magnitude and the difference is immense. Finally, I would like to show you a graph that maps the differential capital profits or capitalization, the differential accumulation of the dominant defense contractors against our measure for dominant capital, which I take from the CompuStat 500. Now, again, I want to show that these companies had really profited from the war in Iraq. Now, you do see a jump in the late 2000s, but it is not really as great as I expected it to be. There are a whole series of problems that I found when measuring these top 10 defense contractors. Number one, consider the following. General Electric, which was, since the 1950s, one of the largest U.S. corporations, has net income and market capitalization far greater than any of the other defense firms. So my index is compromised, for example, by the inclusion or exclusion of General Electric. This graph is without General Electric. I just did not want to dissuade you. I'm sure there are plenty of questions concerning the methodology and philosophy underpinning this presentation. I'd be happy to answer your questions. And thank you.
All right, we have about 25 minutes for questions for our panelists. If we could maybe keep the questions brief, we could maybe take 3 at a time and then allow the panelists to answer.
Thank you. That was really interesting. So I'm wondering what this means for war. 2 options come to my mind. One is that war, at least the declaration of war by the United States, does not occur at the behest of defense contractors. That's one possibility. Another I'm thinking about is maybe ideology of a small group of people, like the Project for the New American Century and things like that, may have a really strong influence on U.S. foreign policy. I'm just wondering if you can just talk about that for a little bit. Thanks.
Are there any other questions? Eric could answer, and if people are still thinking about what to ask, yeah, I guess you can.
Was that Joe Francis? Who just asked that question? Nice to meet you. I'm glad you asked that question. I'd like to answer in a kind of roundabout way. I think that if you look at all the literature concerning the military-industrial complex, since the 1960s, you've really seen a decline in political economy. You see a greater share of explanations that use, say, Derrida, like these guys like James Derrida, Michael Shapiro, and David Campbell. They completely distanced themselves from political economy. Now, the reason they did that is because they were against economistic explanations of war. And the thing is, I actually share that judgment. But one thing I do not share is their purely cultural analysis of war. The purpose, therefore, of this presentation is simply reintegrate political economy. And I really would not like it to be read, for example, as simply war is determined by the profit-seeking practices of a few corporations. I think if you want a much more convincing explanation, Nitzen and Bischler give one that integrates the petrodollar coalition. I did not analyze this in this presentation because I wanted to look at just the defense sector. But there's plenty left to answer on that plate there. Thanks.
Anyone else would like to ask a question of the panelists? Please, John.
My question is to Ken Birch. If you can define financialization.
So what I was trying to do in terms of financialization was essentially thinking about the power of the international financial markets. So in the presentation, that's why I was talking about the euro markets and the importance of those euro markets.
Just to follow up on that question and the answer, I'm not sure I understand. Markets are mechanisms. They're not, maybe you think otherwise, but I'm just not sure how markets and in what sense markets exercise power. And how and why do you think that financial markets now are more or less powerful than before?
Okay, shorthand, financial markets, it means the financiers then. So when talking about international financial markets, shorthand for talking about international financiers. Meaning people who are trading in those international markets.
So that's all capitalism.
Sure.
Thank you. This is a question for G. Thank you very much for your presentation. I found a lot of very interesting similarities with some of the things I have found by studying the European Union and its governance and the way in which the kind of topics that you touched upon are, can be empirically, if you like, examined in the European Union. I wonder, do you have in your mind, after you've done this analysis, do you have in your mind any empirical examples of how what you described can be applied? I mean, maybe from Korea or East Asia? I mean, do you see, for example, this kind of tendencies that you described as something that is concentrating in the European or North American, if you like, world or globally? Or, are there kind of regional differences? I mean, I really liked very much that you end at the end, at the point where I kind of ended, which is the rise of what I call the authoritarian capitalism, and you call it authoritarian statism or something. But I think my fear is that the next version of, the Creorder, if I can use that term, is the rise of authoritarian forms of capitalist Creorder or order. I wonder if you want to comment on that. Thank you.
Yes, this is also a question for G and follows on from Theo's question. You're presenting neoliberalism as a complex. Does that mean to argue that the sustainability or reproducibility of neoliberalism, in whatever dimension that you want to focus on in the first instance, depends upon the co-presence or coupling of the other moments of neoliberalism with whatever your entry point might be? And would this be a way of thinking about the stability or reproducibility of neoliberalism to find to what extent the complex of factors and their mutual reinforcement or compatibility is present rather than a single aspect of that? Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for Eric. I was wondering why you decided to just take the top 10 rather than all military contractors, because KBR, I saw KBR up there, and it used to be part of Halliburton, I believe, and then it separated.
Subsidiary.
Right, so if you keep them both, even after they've separated, wouldn't that distort the sample? Wouldn't it be better to just look at the entire sector?
I guess we can give the panelists an opportunity to respond.
Okay. thank you for the comment. As for the empirical study, I specialize in Korean political economy and Korean capitalism, but recently I began to be interested in global political economy, and literally. So actually, when I talk about this complex order, I actually thought about the what Peter Gowan calls dollar Wall Street regime, and also IMF Wall Street treasury complex and neoliberal hegemony, neoliberal ruling blocks. But the point is, I think that actually I had no time to talk about the theoretical implication of this way of theorizing neoliberalism, because if there are at least three, although I think financial accumulation is the most important feature of neoliberalism, but the other two aspects, the political project and the governmentality, is as probably as important as this accumulation aspect. Then we may actually distinguish this between the different forms of neoliberalism, where governmentality is more salient. I mean, there are some capitalism that the financial accumulation is more salient, and there can be another kind of liberal capitalism where the political attack on the working class and people are more salient. And so this is, I think, this opens up a way in which we can actually theorize further what is recently called variegated neoliberalism. And so I think that it can be applied to many different cases of neoliberalism, and I never thought that actually I would apply this scheme to empirical study, apart from this the global political economic order, and I will consider from now on how I can apply this to, for example, Korean capitalism, because I got some responses from Korean scholars that this scheme doesn't really fit the Korean reality. So I must actually solve that question. As for the authoritarian statism and authoritarian capitalism, I think neoliberalism itself was authoritarian, and it probably authoritarian. If our society becomes more authoritarian, it is now it's because it is challenged socially and politically more than ever, and so I'm not sure whether we can say that probably authoritarian capitalism will replace neoliberal capitalism or not, because neoliberal capitalism is already to some extent authoritarian. And as for the Bob Jessup's comment, there's certain, I think there is their codependence and mutual interrelationship. How can I say, enhances the reproducibility of the system, but I don't think this is the only forces that maintain neoliberal capitalism. So even though there is a structural coupling between these three, if financial accumulation fails permanently, so if the current structural reform and effort to restore the neoliberal capital accumulation order, then probably that will knock down others. So people will no longer believe in the self-help or the possibility of self-risk management, and so the neoliberal government will decline as well, and political, of course, that this political aspect of neoliberalism will hit even harder than the governmentality. So we think more, I think we need to think something more than this relationship between the three aspects of neoliberalism in thinking about how stable, how regularized the neoliberal capitalism is. Indeed, actually, they are in a kind of contingent necessary relations. They are not in a necessary relations originally. They are contingent because none of them logically implies each other. But through a historical process of interarticulation and translation of interest, they come together and create a kind of order, and produce a necessary effect of neoliberal stability. But if any one of them collapse, then there opens up that opens up a possibility of transformation.
The gentleman seated above, thank you for the question. From last year's conference and criticism I hear of the capitalist power approach that I frequently hear is that it is a tautological definition of power. Therefore, in the case of my paper, I'm looking at the top 10, and therefore the top 10 are the most powerful because they're the top 10. In fact, what I tried to do in this presentation and in this research is develop a methodology for the selection. You're correct. I could have looked at more defense contractors. I could have looked at the top 25, the top 100, or all of them, for that matter. The reason that I select top 10, and frankly, if I really wanted to have it my way, I would pick maybe the top 5 or 6, especially for the contemporary period, because the definition is dynamic. We look at the relative share of those companies' profits and capitalization. So frankly, if you look at, again, the list that I gave you, you look at Humana, KBR, they're just not really reaching those levels of the big 5 right now. General Dynamics, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin. So yes, of course, the definition is tentative, and I'm open to criticism, of course. Jonathan Nitzan, for example, uses 15 firms. And of course, that limit begs the question, why there? I think, though, that I justified this selection because I tabulated, say, for example, the top 100 firms, the portion that they receive the entire Pentagon budget. And I may be repeating myself, but those top 10 appropriate close to 35% of the entire Pentagon budget. The next 90 have the same share. So we're talking about 10 companies that are equal in size to the next 90. And that to me only suggests that those are defense-dependent, large and defense-dependent companies, and therefore they have, it's logical to assume, for example, that they have an influence on the American policy-making process.
Sorry, I had to come back to some of the comments that G made. The issue of authoritarian capitalism as a later, the next version, I think we should take it quite seriously. You're absolutely right. Neoliberalism was authoritarian, but I think, especially post-crisis, what we are facing is some kind of situation where, at least from the neoliberal side, the problem of neoliberalism is considered to be that it was too liberal, and we have to move into a more kind of strict and authoritarian forms of imposing the rule of the market to extract more and more profit from societies that they can offer less and less. And I think that meets the points that were made in the presentation by Nitzan earlier, when he saw that we might be reaching this kind of limits. So I think we, there's an area there we can reflect about the future directions. So that's a bit of a comment, to continue this discussion. My question is actually to Jordan. I found your graphs really very interesting.
Eric.
Sorry, Eric. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Sorry, Eric. Eric, I found your graphs very very interesting. I wonder if you wanted to comment a little.
Which one?
So the one about the last one when you saw the. I think it was when you saw the rather stagnant. Graphs of the various sectors, and the only one that was increasing was the personnel.
All right, the data items.
The data,
the defense budget.
Yeah. Now, in my understanding, the defense budget in the U.S. played two roles. One was defense, but the other one was almost like an indirect subsidy to industrial innovation, etc. I mean, if you compare it to other European or other countries, it is very clear that subsidization of industry in the U.S. takes place through a lot of it through the defense budget. Now, in your understanding, this shift towards this, personnel services kind of part of the defense budget, does it signify also a qualitative change in the way this subsidization process takes place?
There's one more question at the back, and then I guess we'll have to end the question period. We have 5 minutes left, so if the question could be brief, and then the panelists can make a quick response.
My question is for G. It's a very simple question. Following your concept of financial dictatorship, do you believe that the interests of industry can be separate from the interests of finance? With specific reference to cartelization of banks.
Understood your question correctly. Capitalism is, as Nietzsche and Bickler says, intrinsically financial, and the capital is originally finance. But this this statement is, I think, is made at the level of the real, at the level of the capitalism in general. And if we differentiate between different levels of analysis, we can talk about industrial, agricultural, or financial capitalism. It's because we should distinguish between the means and ends. Ends is always financial, but the means to achieve is not necessarily financial. Of course, capitalists calculate these means always in terms of finance and money. So it appears as something related to money and finance. But there is always something that cannot be reduced to finance. For example, Japanese and German capitalism, they could develop not based on financial, not through the financial channel or financial industries. Their main competitiveness in the industry. And you know that people tend to like Japanese cars more than American cars, and capitalists, of course, have a way how to translate these differences into monetary terms. But still, I think there is something that cannot be reduced to these monetary terms, and actually this thing that cannot be reduced to finance and monetary actually is essential to the competitiveness of this Japanese car. And of course, this is not the competitiveness of the thing, but the competitiveness of the social relations in Japanese society. So there is a power. And I'm a bit confused when, for example, Nietzsche and Bickler says, on the one hand, capital is finance, and on the other hand, capital is power. But if I have to, maybe Nietzsche and Bickler don't want to choose between the two. But if I have to choose between the two, I think capital is power rather than money. So I think that is why the title of the book is not capital as money, but capital as power. Is it sufficient answer to you? So there is capitalism in general, which is financial and monetary and pecuniary. And there is capitalism institutionally and strategically mediated at the concrete level. So there are financial capitalism, industrial capitalism, and political capitalism, etc.
So if I understand you correctly, then you would reject Hilferding's...
Sorry, we're actually running out of time. So if you guys would like to continue this conversation, give Eric a chance to respond before we end.
Yeah, about the subsidy. Again, the earlier theorists of the military-industrial complex, Brown and Sweezy, Seymour Melman, and of course, these guys all had a different conception of what that military-industrial complex was. They argued that U.S. capitalism in the post-World War II period was premised on a type of military Keynesianism. I couldn't cover all that because of time limitations, but implicit in my presentation is a criticism of this model. For example, the guys at Monthly Review argue that nothing has really changed in the military-industrial complex since the post-World War II period. I consider that judgment to be untenable, or at very least extremely difficult to negotiate. Because let's just take a simple presupposition. If indeed you can get your country out of recession by pumping dollars into the military, then why don't they just quadruple the Pentagon budget and then end this recession once and for all? I think that this is a limited strategy. And in fact, if you ask the question, if the public sector in the United States supports capitalism, whatever that means, then they would be using the same logic as any other investor. And in that respect, I would say they would just put their money where the money is. So whether that be pharmaceuticals, defense, computer, etc. I think there has been a shift. It's no longer the military taking the largest share of that.
All right, if we could just thank our presenters, and then we have about a 15-minute break until the next panel.